Hi guys, so for this week's video I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. It's actually a tutorial. There are a lot of tutorials that I've been meaning to do for you, but this one in particular is the first one that I'm actually putting up because I went looking for tutorials on how to do this and I wasn't able to actually find anything. And I do think that it's a very useful technique for getting more out of your compositions, especially if you tend to find yourself just, taking the literal shape of an object and sticking that somewhere kind of in frame, rule of thirds and you're good. It'll push you out of that box and take you a little bit further, and it's a really useful exercise. I encourage you to try it out. It's a little bit tricky at first, but hopefully I broke it down enough to make it easy to follow along. If you're curious what sort of art you can do with this or how you can take it the next step past just drawing strange lines, this is a piece that I just recently completed just a few days ago, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I'm planning on doing a whole series of paintings using this technique. So yeah, I encourage you to experiment with it, see what you can do with it, and hopefully learn something. And as always, if you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye. What I'd like to talk about today is formal and informal composition. That all sounds really fancy, but it basically just means asymmetrical composition versus symmetrical composition. So you can see these composition exercises that I've done here. I'll just sort of scroll them across the screen. The first 5 that you're seeing on that top row are informal compositions, and those are essentially just asymmetrical compositions, and I'll show you how to subdivide those in ways that you're going to get some really attractive results. And then here we've got some formal compositions along the bottom, and those are essentially just very symmetrical compositions that you see a lot in classical artwork. And by the way, all of this is covered in the works of Andrew Loomis. I don't know exactly which books they're covered in. I looked in, I have Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, and I looked through there and I couldn't find these in there. But Andrew Loomis is the one that sort of broke all of this down, and he's the primary reference for all of this. So if you need to review, you can find his stuff on Pinterest if you search for Andrew Loomis composition. All of his stuff is great. So his technique for subdivision of informal composition. First of all, what would be the advantage of creating a composition using this method? Well, it's essentially a way of making your compositions much more interesting. Because if you're like me, you have a tendency to let the literal shape of an object dictate where it fits into a composition. So, say you've got a square here, you put the person's face here, and that's your composition. Or you've got a figure here running through the center of the page, or maybe you set them off to the side because, hey, rule of thirds. But there's a lot to be desired with that, and so you certainly don't need to follow these rules. And the bottom line hard and fast rule of composition is, if it looks good, then it is good. But if you're looking for something a little more structured and a little more complex, I highly recommend using this as a basis, because it can kind of just break the box and get you thinking of much more interesting ways to compose your images. And just as an example, these are some thumbnail sketches that I did based on these compositions that I was just now showing you. And you can see where, you know, I've placed my figure along those guidelines, and what you'll find especially effective is if you place your focal point where those lines converge, because what that's going to do is the eye is going to naturally gravitate to that point. If we've got all of these intersections that are sort of converging on this central location, if you compose your image around that central location using that as your focal point, you're essentially going to be crafting an image that is pointing the viewer on all sides toward that one strong focal point. And everything in that composition is going to be reinforcing that central focal point, and you're going to wind up with a really strong image. So I highly encourage you to give this method a try when you get a chance. I think you'll be surprised the cool things that you can do with it. And then formal compositions. Okay, so rules of informal subdivision, or informal subdivision of composition. By the way, I will be using a 90-degree triangle for this. This is fantastic to have on hand. It's a great straight edge because you can essentially just line up your angles and always get a perfectly perpendicular line. You can also use a ruler for this. I use a sewing ruler because it has a grid on it and it's transparent. This thing I got in high school and it's fantastic. I've never found another ruler that I like better. But the moral of the story here is that right angles are your friend. And this sort of thing, I mean, you can invest in one, but you could also very easily just make one out of some spare cardboard. I mean, 90 degrees and you're done. So, alright, so step one for subdivision of an informal composition. The first thing that you're going to do, you are going to place a vertical line down your composition. You do not want it to be on a half, on a third, or on a fourth. And when you're working this small, that can be difficult to achieve, but just bear with me. And I'm going to line that up so it's perpendicular. And just so you know, I'm using tracing paper for this because if I do wind up wanting to trace these compositions onto a different piece of paper, the thinner tracing paper it'll be easier for the light to transmit through, and that's going to create a clearer image when I'm tracing it. But you can really use whatever you want for this. So we've got our single line that's perpendicular through the composition. Then what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line from one corner to the other and essentially cut it in half diagonally. And it can be whichever corner you want, but just connect two of your corners. And I'm going to go between these 2 points because I want my focal point to be in this direction. And the more you practice this, the better you'll get at sort of controlling where these focal points wind up. So if you do have sort of a vague idea in mind for your composition, you'll know how to sort of direct it toward that. So now what we're going to do is we are going to draw a horizontal line running through that intersection. All right, good job. Now, we're going to start subdividing these various rectangles that have been created so far. So, I kind of want things to be radiating from this corner. So I'm going to start subdividing these rectangles like this. Now, one thing you definitely want to avoid, and Andrew Loomis really stresses this, you want to avoid forming an X directly through the middle of any of your shapes. So because I have a line going from this corner to this corner in this rectangle, we don't want to draw a line going from this corner to this corner. And because I have a line going from this corner to this corner of this rectangle now, I would not want to put one going from this corner to this corner. So we want to avoid perfect perpendicular subdivisions of space. So I'm going to put a line here now. And you're starting to see how that's developing. And then I think I'm also going to put a line here from this corner of this rectangle to this corner up here. And I don't think it really matters that you account for every single rectangle. The main point of this is to just give yourself some jumping off points. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start adding horizontal lines and vertical lines at those intersections. So anywhere you have lines that cross, you can add a horizontal or vertical line. And again, I kind of want my focal point to be over on this side, so I'm going to focus on getting more of my lines on this side. And you see, the more lines you draw, the more intersections you create. You can also come back and draw more diagonals, however you like. So if I wanted to come from this corner to this corner and create sort of a triangle happening in there. Or if I wanted to keep some lines radiating from this point, there. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, but wait, where did all of those circles come from? Because on the sheet that I showed you, I have a lot of circles happening. Well, those are not included in Andrew Loomis's directions for subdivision of informal composition, but I like circles and I think that they are extremely useful tools for composition. So, what you can do at this point, depending on what you have access to, I have some circle stencils here. I have some French curves here, which are very helpful. You can do all of this just with a compass, so just use whatever tools you have available to you. I actually really like circle stencils because they're just the easiest to get the result that I'm looking for. I kind of struggle with compasses because, you know, even when I'm using a really sharp pointed one, I tend to, you know, they slip all over the place or I gouge my paper. I'm really bad at using compasses. So, you know, stencil is nice because I can see exactly what the result is going to be and I can place it exactly where I want it to go. And I tend to like to follow the same rules that have been established for creating the other lines in these compositions. That is, I like to essentially place the edges of the circle at points of intersection. So if I find a diameter that is going to hit this edge and come off of these two sides of the composition, I think that's going to look really nice. And there's my circle. So that is informal composition. I will do one more to demonstrate that technique one more time, but really I highly suggest that you just practice this a few times, do a few on your own, and really familiarize yourself with the process, because it can really be a useful jumping off point. Okay, so I think I'll call it good for informal composition. So let's just go over formal composition really quick. Formal composition is, as I said before, essentially symmetrical composition. So you're going to be gridding off your space equally on both sides, where you can actually see it for one thing. Ignore that, that was a mistake, but what you can basically see here is that I have divided my composition into fourths on both the vertical and the horizontal. And this doesn't have to be exact. It can be kind of a pain to be super precise. I know I was trying to do fifths yesterday and it was driving me crazy, so I ended up mostly just eyeballing it. And, you know, if you can get it approximately where you want it, I consider that to be good enough. I feel like some people would probably murder me hearing me say that, but it's really just a guideline, you know? So I don't feel like you have to be super strict with getting it just right. So we've got this grid, and from here, as long as you keep it symmetrical, you can basically just start connecting lines wherever you want. So, and there are a whole bunch of established ways that you can do this, but, you know, say we go from there to there, and then there to there, and start creating sort of a radiating pattern. then we do it on our other side to keep things symmetrical. And then we could frame it off by connecting this corner and this corner. And, you know, maybe we want some opposition, so we bring in some lines there. Okay, so hopefully you can see those, but basically I've got some formal compositions down here, and this was the one that I divided in fifths that was a complete pain. This one was fourths and just a very basic subdivision of space, and I essentially just centered my figure and centered my elements and placed all of my background elements in to align with that grid. And what that will do for your symmetrical compositions is it will make them look very deliberate and essentially very attractive. I've had a lot of success with this so far. I haven't used it a lot in the past because I know it can be a little complicated to try and grasp for the first time. But again, I highly recommend that you give it a shot with your art. I think studying this technique can really teach you a lot, and it's not something that you need to use all the time, but I do think it's a much more powerful tool than simply abiding by the rule of thirds all the time. So if this was helpful to you, please give this video a thumbs up, maybe share it with your friends, and I will see you again soon.